Ah, splendid. Right, I
Very
think
good.
that's good. Fantastic. Well, welcome back to Beyond the Text with me, Samuel Woodall.
Me, Jack Thomson.
Fantastic. We didn't talk over each other this time. That's good stuff.
But there was a delay.
And
because we were both
yes,
hesitant.
yeah, we'll cut that out. We'll cut that. No one will know anything. No one.
Okay.
However, welcome back to the final episode of essentially what we were studying in our reading club seminars that Jack and I have been running over the past couple of months, which was the Liberty series of the history of ideas and political thought reading club. And today we're going to be looking at two quintessential figures, bringing us up to our own time, John Rawls and Michael Sandel. Now, I will be going through the first of those thinkers, John Rawls, in some detail, and then Jack and I will have a bit of discourse over some questions that we raised in the session and some of our own since then. And then Jack will take over and do a little bit of a preamble on Sandel and how Sandel contributes to the discourse of liberty. But yes, in the meantime, Jack, how have you been? Have you been well?
I've been very well, thank you. Yes.
Oh, fantastic! The viewers missed out on you enjoying a nice cup of coffee and a biscuit.
Well, I still have the coffee.
Oh, wonderful! Yes. And everything's been going well with your classes over in the Netherlands.
Very good. Yeah. Last time we spoke, we were doing St. Paul's letters to the Romans. This week we started Augustine's Confessions, which has been really it's been spectacular.
Has he stolen the
what a
pair
rich
yet?
Book.
Has he stolen the pair
we're
from
in book 5, so we did his whole adolescence. So he's gone to Milan, and he'll have his conversion in book 6, which is what we're reading for Friday. Book 6 through 9.
And how is the book classified in your readings? Because I mean, essentially, it is the first autobiography, isn't it?
It is apparently, yes. So, that was mentioned in our seminar. It's a theological text primarily. It's confession. The title Confessions is has multiple meanings. It's a confession of his sins, but it's also a confession in the more positive sense. We have a king, Edward the Confessor. Well, it's not because
of piety and dedication. Yeah.
The idea that the revelation of Christ was saturated in his vocation and how he conducted himself in all his affairs, and that was on display for the world to see. So Augustine is retrospectively going through his life and announcing all the ways he's realized that God has positively influenced his life through providence, even when he was ignorant of it, and that's sort of this other meaning of Confessions.
And of course, it has a lasting impact on the literary or the political literary world, because Descartes will have his Confessions, and then Rousseau has Confessions. So a couple of thinkers that we've discussed throughout the series.
Descartes had Confessions.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Very good. I knew about Rousseau's.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, Descartes famously ends, I think, his Confessions by sort of laying out all the issues that he's encountered with his theory, with his rationalism, and then famously ends it, and people can't tell whether or not he was being ironic by saying that the solution to these issues is God, and then just ends.
Well, yeah. I mean, I believe him. I think he was sincere. But I guess it would be useful if we could fill that in a bit.
And who knows how Rousseau ends his? Probably some weird made-up story about how he was a fantastic contributor to his society.
Well, so I was having an interesting conversation with someone about this the other day, and he was basically making me aware of all the ways that Rousseau's Confession actually was quite positively, quite concretely influenced by Augustine. Not just in like an inversion. I mean, so he has his own pear story. For instance, he goes and steals an aubergine, but it's the complete opposite message that he draws from it. It's not that he had a desire for evil for its own sake, which is what Augustine says, but rather that society had forced on him
To have no other option.
So society had corrupted a desire which was originally good, mainly to do someone a service, to obey a crime, basically. But he also has, but in the early chapters, in his analysis of infants, which Augustine also is a place where Augustine begins, they both agree, Rousseau more strongly than Augustine, that the most basic motive of a baby is to tyrannize and to punish.
Yes.
That was quite amusing to discover that Rousseau also thought that, and that's possibly why he abandoned his family.
Multiple times.
Yeah. So,
but someone who doesn't abandon his family and thinks about us as a global family is John Rawls. Magnificent segue as per usual on this podcast. Now, John Rawls sits, I would say, semi-comfortably within the liberty canon, because Rawls in his own day was criticised by people on the left for being not left-wing enough, for being sort of a status quo perpetuator and not really coming up with enough of a revolutionary theory to emancipate those who were dispossessed and hard up in the world. And he was criticised by people on the centre and then into the right of the political spectrum for being more of a socialist, for being a social democrat. And actually, Rawls semi-admits this by the sort of later part of his life, sort of almost aligning with the third way social democracy that we see with things like New Labour, Bill Clinton in the States. So he sits uncomfortably in the political canon, but often those kind of characters are the kind of ones you want to delve into and explore why they're complex. So that's what we're going to do today. So John Rawls was born in 1921 and he died in 2002. So 2 years after I was born. Jack, is that how long around is that?
2002. Yeah, that was when I was born.
Oh, there we are. Right. Maybe we have Rawls reincarnate here.
I hope not.
He stands as one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, shaping modern liberal thought with his A Theory of Justice in 1971. His vision of justice as fairness, grounded in the principles of equality and individual liberty, sought to reconcile the tensions between freedom and social cooperation. Rawls uses the original position and veil of ignorance, which provide a powerful framework for justifying a redistributive liberal democracy. His ideas sparked intense debate, most notably with Robert Nozick, whose Anarchy, State and Utopia in 1974 mounted a libertarian critique of Rawls. Nozick rejected the emphasis on distributive justice, arguing instead for a minimal state that respected individuals' natural property rights, so very classical Lockean, as we explored when we were looking at Locke and Paine. This rivalry defined a key fault line in contemporary political philosophy between egalitarian liberalism and libertarianism, shaping debates on justice, rights, and the role of the state that persist today. In 1985, Rawls published an essay, Justice as Fairness, Political, Not Metaphysical, which marked a key difference in his thought, clarifying his theory as a form of political liberalism, rather than a comprehensive moral doctrine. To critiques of a theory of justice, Rawls' emphasis was more on the idea that justice was fairness, but not grounded in any specific metaphysical or religious worldview, but instead it's a freestanding political conception that can be endorsed by citizens with diverse moral and philosophical commitments. And I think what that's responding to is something we'll probably come on to, which is sort of the issue with these kind of universalizing political doctrines that sort of don't take into account the situation and the individual. Jack, I know that you're very passionate on that critique, I think, for this sort of a conceptual field. The move reflected Rawls' growing concern with stability within pluralistic societies, and it laid the groundwork for his later tome, Political Liberalism, in 1993. So what was the political liberalism? Well, This represented a major development in Rawls's thought, and it shifted focus from justice as a moral ideal to justice as a basis for political stability in pluralistic societies. So that's a little bit reminiscent of when we were discussing the ideas of Camus and the need for both political freedom and political and economic justice. He responds to the critiques of the theory of justice again by emphasizing that liberal democracy must not rest on any single comprehensive doctrine, but instead on a political conception of justice that people within diverse worldviews can endorse. And then we come to his first great work of the 1970s, A Theory of Justice. Now, for the reading club, Jack and I assigned chapter 4 of this reading, which is titled Equal Liberty. And this is where John Rawls articulates the foundational role of basic liberties in his theory of justice. He argues that each person should have an equal right to a system of liberties that is compatible with the same rights of others. These include political freedoms, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience, and personal freedoms like freedom of thought and the right to hold personal property. Rawls asserts that these liberties are what he terms lexically prior to considerations of social and economic advantage, meaning they cannot be sacrificed for greater economic efficiency or wealth distribution, even though those are still components of his thought. He critiques utilitarianism for allowing individual rights to be compromised for the sake of a just society. Rawls insists that a just society must protect these liberties as inviolable, forming the foundation of modern democratic legitimacy and social cooperation. So today, Jack and I will go through this sort of core Rawlsian principle in the theory of justice, its justifications, and its implications for contemporary liberal democracies. So we obviously have some questions, Jack, from the reading club, but I wondered whether there was a point at which you might like to start out in terms of how you came at this text, how you understood it, and your sort of preconceptions about Rawls. But obviously, Hayek was engaging with these economic scholars in the 70s. So how did you come at this text? You're on mute, Jack. I'm sure it's wise words, wise words.
So my apologies, sorry, I forgot to turn that off. There was some movement upstairs. So I had a very limited idea of Rawls before we did this seminar. I understood he was in the quite a big in the modern libertarian tradition, almost bringing about a revival of that. And it's interesting because in many ways, Hayek also, in his own way, styles himself as that kind of a figure. So Hayek would present himself as recovering an authentic liberal constitutionalism or constitutional liberalism. I don't know which way that should be. And recovering an authentic democracy, let's say, against the many plights it had suffered in the 20th century. Now, Rawls also seemed to be claiming to do this, but the two do it with very different, in fact, incompatible concepts of justice. And it's to justice that Rawls particularly turns to make his case. One of the things that I tried to understand a bit more when we did our seminar was this idea of lexical priority, which I hadn't really understood before. Why? Well, when you read Rawls, it seems that he goes back and forth between advocating redistribution and someone who isn't. And that was a tension I felt was somewhat powerful throughout our discussion last time, but particularly with this concept of lexical priority, because he has asserted the lexical priority of property rights, but then he had a theory of justice which says that inheritance it has no intrinsic value, that no one has any intrinsic innate right to something by virtue of what their parents had or where they're born or whatever. And property seems to be quite tied up with that. At least as one of the major places that we see, discussion of property, inheritance, and to deal with what he perceives as inequality in the domain of inheritance. My understanding is that he would advocate some degree of redistribution, and then that seems to suggest to me that the lexical priority has been forsaken. That now the property can be sacrificed for economic gain. That's at least a surface reading. I don't know if we can reconcile these tensions at all.
Well, I mean, the whole idea of lexical priority does sort of, like all of these sort of, as much as he's rejecting utilitarianism, he still sort of occupies that theoretical space in a sense, because he's doing very similar things to why a lot of philosophers see the utilitarians as complex and thereby essentially useless, because this idea of lexical priority is a bit like the hedonic calculus, which is that obviously for the utilitarians, the hedonic calculus was working out in a situation how much, how much impact, how many people, what's the intensity, what's the propinquity, what's the how you were supposed to do that within every ethical situation that you encountered. It's obviously impossible. And in a similar way, you don't come into a political or ethical situation and think, right, well, what I'll do is I'll lexically prioritize the three aspects that Rawls has laid out for me here. So, right, we've got rights, but let's weigh that up against how far distribution needs to be done here. And every scenario have to go through that methodology. So I do think it's complicated. But obviously, because he's had it in this clause, it does mean that he is still at the vanguard of individual rights. And he does say in the chapter 4, each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. So obviously for him, the individual is the priority. He was actually not decommissioned, but he was demoted during his final stages of being in the army because he refused to beat another soldier. His presiding officer had said to him that he needed to discipline another member of the army who were at that point occupying Japan, 1946, after the conclusion of the war. And he said that he couldn't see any reason why he would be justified in beating another soldier. So clearly he is thinking about individuals. However, that has to be weighed up against welfare as a whole. And again, looking at the historical context, I mean, the reason he then resigns from the army is because he can't see how the use of nuclear weapons in Japan. He becomes completely disillusioned when he sees the sort of impact and fallout of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima whilst he's there as the occupying force. So yeah, I mean, how can these, it's a perennial issue in political philosophy of how can justice and political freedom be synthesized. And I don't think anyone has necessarily has a solution to that issue, do they? But in a similar vein to Camus, he does say about how even if formally granted, political liberty loses its value whenever those who are better off are able to control the course of policy to their advantage. Now, as a political thinker, Rawls is forged out of a very class-based society. And throughout his life, he rejects these kind of what is essentially given to him as a white middle-class man in 1930s America as he's going through his university experience. And when he comes out of university, instead of taking a commission and going into the army as an officer, he says, I don't see why just because I'm a university graduate, I should go into the army at a higher rank than my American compatriots who are going in at a base level. So he goes in at a base level as well. Right. And because of this rigid class system, I think he's very worried that there will be an eternal politicking solely solely dominated by those who are wealthy enough to be there, and that will create a self-perpetuating system. So I think for him, the resolution would be democratic participation that's much more broad. So then you'd be representing those individuals who don't come from that walk of life. Obviously, that's kind of the idea that has stuck. You know, that is the dog that barks in terms of Rawls' ideas lasting in political philosophy. That is the idea that most liberal democratic countries now have, which is this idea of sort of sectional interests, or, you know, pushing positive discrimination to push underrepresented groups into legislative assemblies to try and create policies that are reflective of a diversifying society. But it still doesn't fundamentally answer your question, which is, can there ever be a sort of perfect balance between political liberty and political justice or economic justice? But I think that somewhat goes in the direction of maybe how Rawls would come at it. What about you, Jack? Do you think there's anything else there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand that he is conscious of what he would describe as like, you know, ideal theory, or you know, both, you know, theory and practice.
Yeah.
He is aware of discrepancy, but this seems a bit more like fundamental, and I don't necessarily mean to, like, you know, to blame him for that, because I think you were right in connecting this to what is a perennial problem. We want to declare rights, but also we're sensitive to excess. Even John Locke was. In the second treatise, he writes about, although man has a natural right to property and to cultivate the land, there is obviously, he basically said it is obvious that there is such a thing as an excess, and people shouldn't go beyond the excess. And how in the turn of the 20th century, or the turn of the 20th, in the second half of the 20th century, sorry, into the present day, you know, the idea that there is excess in things, excess in business, in capital and so forth, has, you know, enjoyed a popular resurgence, and so Rawls is in many ways one of the thinkers for the time. But yeah, then what is the value of lexical priority? And what else is lexically prior?
So the redistribution, and also it is I think it's to do with redistribution, and the lexical priority is liberty. So that's the one that must come before the rest, and then it's redistribution and creating a sort of political system that is redistributive. If you see what I mean. So that is part of the system, but the priority must always be individual rights.
Yeah, I've just in my notes, I've recovered the two principles of justice as fairness.
Yes.
Maybe that would be worth some discussion in connection with this. So the first principle: each person has the same indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which scheme is compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. So we're under the same structure of governance, let's say, you know, abstractly speaking, not necessarily the same concrete system of governance. Second principle, which comes in two parts: social and economic inequalities must satisfy two conditions. First, they are to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair, equal, and fair equality of opportunity. That's a very modern concept, very straightforward. Part two of that second principle: they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged member of society. This is called his difference principle.
Yeah.
So you can so there is some degree of tolerance given to economic inequality
and variation, and it's added in that final clause that the difference principle facilitates a fluctuation in equality, because although he does say a fair equality of opportunity, you need to have something there to say, well, obviously, because of even mere deterministic traits, say geographical constraints, or I suppose a bit like Hayek in terms of sort of like natural disaster. Well, you want to, for rules, you'd want to do something about that, but a natural disaster is obviously going to set back a peoples within the area that a natural disaster occurs than somewhere else, and you can't do anything about that. So you have to allow for difference.
Yes, yeah, and I guess another motivation there is there is advantage to the excess inequalities insofar as their endeavors, their profits are fed back into the community, let's say, and into the broader society. So I think he gives an example of teachers' pay or something, which I thought was a bit random, but
yeah,
must be something about the 70s.
And I mean, he's writing this at a time where distributive theories of justice are, which is kind of odd, because quite a lot of the thinkers that we've studied so far aren't, they're writing in a vein that's sort of intellectual lone star. It's like pushing society forward. These liberty thinkers are thinking either critically about their society and what they want to change, or they're thinking something better from a historical analogy, say, that could be taken forward to today. What's odd about Rawls is that he's coming at the end of a distributive economic period in history. And I mean, if we want to talk about the viability of political ideas, ultimately Rawls is essentially wrong. His ideas aren't taken up. It flips massively in the other direction within the next decade to monetarist economic policy, advocated by Nozick somewhat, but you could say really more of Milton Friedman, obviously, who is the quintessential economic thinker. And it's odd, I find, that he's kind of coming at the end of a period of distributive justice, that, the New Deal in the US, Labour government in the UK, that's kind of backing the unions and supporting kind of these mass organisations that are to do with distribution. So I suppose for historical context, what we see in a thinker like Rawls is someone who's looking very much as an internationalist. And this is where the idea of his behind the veil of ignorance comes in. So should I maybe go into that, and then we can do a bit of back and forth from there?
But a question came to mind as you were explaining that, if I could. Do you think then we are prone to interpreting Rawls as someone who's trying to make the positive case for, say, redistribution, when a better way of reading him, a more appropriate, more historically informed way of reading him, would be to view him as trying to limit it?
Potentially, or I suppose he's not coming up with something innovative. He's trying to come up with essentially a more efficient way of doing what he thinks states are trying to do, but not achieving, sort of thing. So he's not like an existentialist or a revolutionary, and that's why I suppose he sits awkwardly, because as I was saying at the start, left-wing people would be like, well, you're essentially advocating what we have. And that's not working. Whereas he's trying to say, well, I'm a sort of blend of these different ideologies. I'm a blend of libertarianism with redistributive justice on the left. And yeah, I mean, I think he's very unique. And certainly the reactionaries, the ones who want to change society fundamentally, are the Nozicks of the day, the ones who are saying that everything is property. What's his theory? Entitlement theory, which already sounds sort of selfish and sinful.
Yeah, well,
to a lovely lefty like me.
Yeah, well, it's precisely a reaction against Rawls' quite radical insistence that there's no value to inheritance, and Sandel's paper, which we'll move on to later, begins with a scrutiny of Nozick's criticism of Rawls on this point.
And what was I going to say? But yeah, let's discuss the veil, because
that's very interesting.
Because he's an internationalist, so we've talked about his encounters during the war. 2 years after the war concludes, you have the UN Declaration of Human Rights, so the idea that you can universalize these libertarian principles of individual rights. However, critics of something like the Convention on Human Rights, which sounds an odd thing to say, but let's say it anyway. Critics of human rights would argue that then maybe not applicable in every society. That it's for say a post-colonialist, they might say, well, this is just another infringement on countries by Western ideas formulated within Western universities and academics sitting around thinking what's best for the world. So that comes in 1948, and from that, Rawls takes an inspiration, and he thinks, well, if we're doing that, then why can't we envisage a system where in each individual society there's at least some universal parameters that we set to say there has to be a standard of living, there has to be a standard of a quality of life, an economic situation to allow life to be viable like it is in the more flourishing states around the world. So he says that the principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. Now, that's his idea. So this veil of ignorance would shroud our view. It would come down over our heads. I'm sure you'd look lovely in a veil, Jack. Yes. That isn't a proposition. I just want to. This veil would descend over our eyes and would block out any vision of where we might be going in life. So we would go back to this childlike state. He talked about essentially a child in a bubble floating around the earth. And it's what he calls the original position. Now, he thinks that we all want to further our own interests. To do this, he sees that we need to work together. Therefore, we require rules. Rules, not rules, but maybe we require both. Rules. Rules that are fair and just must apply equally to all, ignoring social status or situation. So the principle of justice, therefore, should be chosen behind a veil of ignorance. Now, obviously, this is massively easier said than done, but the idea would be that because you wouldn't know whether you could be born as, you know, whatever cross-section of society in whatever location in the world, you could be a poor farmer with no food, at risk of various diseases. In sub-Saharan Africa, you could be born in Asia into a life of poverty, but you could be born into New York skyscraper in a Trump Tower, living a luxury life. But you don't know. Now, as we've already said, there will always be a difference principle. It's not like he's saying it's going to be flat across the board, but no rational individual would decide that that is a fair system to have, because you have just as much risk of falling into poverty and destitution as you do riches and lavish wealth. So from the original position, he believes that we would create a society where the rules of society support what we've already referred to as a fair equality of opportunity. Liberty and individual liberty is still lexically prior to all this, so the system behind the veil of ignorance would have to prioritize individual liberties in the process of making this ideal world that he's envisaging. But you need to create at least somewhat fair starting point for all humans to thrive. Jack, where does your criticism begin?
Oh, everything. So, I mean, oh goodness, this is an aspect. I mean, this is the basic contention I would have with Rawls, but I came to see this having read Sandel's paper, and at first it didn't really hit me. Okay, so veil of ignorance means to abstract from the social context in which people do live. And Sandel's criticism of this was that that's not how we think about justice. We, if it's, I guess, similar to, you brought up an example earlier. Oh yeah, against the utilitarians, that was it. We don't make these rational calculations. In the same way, it's not obvious that we do always think of justice in very cold, universalizable terms. We think of it at the level of, well, you know, I got this service from this person, and maybe there were family ties there, and I felt that that he owed me something, and you know that's a lot more like the everyday incidents. They're very much bound to our social connections, families, culture, all this. Can we get behind all that?
Yeah.
It seems like it's been increasingly difficult to support that argument, and certainly the literature on these themes has gone in the opposite direction. Not necessarily, you know, for me, not necessarily because a critique of values isn't possible, or a critique of society isn't possible, where you could start to make some quite concrete evaluations about certain ideals of justice that maybe ought to be omnipresent, but it's just it's the first thing I would say is not straightforward to make that critique, and it's very easy to get carried away, and the naive thing to completely sidestep, undermine, undervalue the lived experience. You afraid that's a bit overused, but the dimension of our lives, which is in the world, is situated, as Sartre would say. Which brings me to sort of maybe another more precise criticism. Part of the premise of the veil of ignorance is uncertainty, epistemic uncertainty about circumstances, but that's sort of not really true. In at least one critical sense, which is that there are people in the world who have some idea about the conditions into which their sons and daughters are going to be brought into the world, for instance. So the idea that you as an individual, yes, because you're not in the world, and you become conscious of a certain situation you're in, and you don't even recognize the moment of conflict. But there are people in the world who are planning for the future. So there isn't a radical degree of uncertainty here, and whilst more people are planning in the interest usually of the people who will be in their inheritors, not just their immediately family, but their community and their nation, and they're making sacrifices often to leave something behind for the next generation. And in all these ways, trying to overcome certainty. I think Rawls is far too pessimistic. And this is part of the value of inheritance. It's I think it is a way of counteracting some of that uncertainty, which leads him to feel that he needs to radically abstract from human experience and affairs.
Yeah. Well, he is a quintessential rationalist, isn't he? Because he says that the way of thinking here, if it doesn't work, which obviously it doesn't, he says it won't be a failure of charity. It won't be a failure of like people not feeling emotional enough to like support this. He says it will be a failure of reason. He says that it will be humanity's collective reason that has failed if this system isn't implemented, rather than say a socialist's critique, which would be, oh well, it's just selfish vested interests. Whereas he's saying no, it's not that people are nasty and selfish, but it's that their rationality, if this doesn't happen, isn't leading them to the right conclusion. Which obviously every philosopher could end their argument with.
Yeah. I mean, it could. I mean, in fairness, it could be both. Part of the problem is that there are we have personal interest, and that's not always a bad thing. I think sometimes it is, but part of what is sometimes of personal interest to us is just the preservation of something more local in comparison to something more global, increasingly.
Yeah. But this also, I do want to ask you about this, Jack, because obviously I know you're not a fan of Rawls, but in this period there is a kind of re-emergence of certain faith, politico-ethical faith systems coming out of utilitarianism. So you have someone like Joseph Fletcher, who, in a similar way to Rawls, he's very impacted by the Vietnam War and the dropping of napalm and Agent Orange and the destruction of our natural habitat, and obviously the infliction of immense pain and suffering on humanity. And he says, he comes up with this idea of prioritizing agape, universal love, in everything we do and policies that we implement. And is there not, Rawls was a Christian while he was going through his school and when he went to Princeton, but he sort of lost his faith. But there is still quite I would say, a certain kind of Christian ethic to this idea of kind of us all being born and creating a certain society and system that surely gets us at least to the kind of starting gun of life that gives us a chance.
There is a case to be made for that, which is why I don't go all the way with the people who emphasize the social dimension to existence. You could overstate that and basically come to the conclusion that all cultures are radically incommensurate. You can't compare them. You can't have intercultural dialogue. We're incomprehensible to one another. I think that's just as bad. The difficulty is trying to mediate this sort of collective shared humanity, the shared human experience, and what makes it actually quite distinctive, and also meaningful, which is often what is more the more concrete elements. The thing with sort of the universal postulates is they're all very abstract. Even agape is very abstract, which is why.
But that isn't to say that the monetarists aren't. I mean, that going in the other direction, within a few years, you have someone like Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society. Now, surely we know that there is.
Yeah, right. But she means that. I mean, I guess she means that in the way Hayek also meant that. I mean, I know that I'm necessarily defending either of them on this point, but they had a very specific idea that we were mistaken to predicate anything of society as anything other than an abstraction from lived experience. Even Hayek shouldn't even be saying that, because Hayek believed that there is something metaphysical about an economy where it's neither reducible to reason nor to ground up genetic factors. It sort of hovers in the middle. Society is a bit like that, I think. It's real, but in a very specific sense. And so we have to say, so okay, so if we say, there is social injustice, for instance, well, who do we blame for that? Who do we petition for our rights to be rectified for social injustice? That's a problem Hayek brings to our attention. It's not obvious. I mean, maybe there is an answer to it, but it's a bit like, who do we blame? It's actually inimical to justice when the question of who to petition for right to be rectified is so abstract in that way. It's better if our claims to injustice are directed at individuals.
And of course, he's writing at a time where those social justice campaigns have been on the march. I mean, this book comes out only 3 years after 1968, that moment when it looked like France could turn red with the rioters in the streets in Paris, the campus riots in the States, this kind of moment of potential revolution. And again, in a way, he would be seen as kind of part of the conservative force, really, in his writing, because he's not advocating the overthrow of a regime. He is advocating, obviously, a change and a restructuring. But also, I suppose, he's recognizing the legitimacy of those arguments in terms of the fact that it's only a couple of years before that the Civil Rights Act has been passed by Lyndon Johnson in the States to allow Black people the same rights as whites. So I suppose when we look at this, it is very much within the context of his day. If you were to try and expropriate Rawls' ideas to today, they would sit very differently within the kind of debates that we're talking about in terms of contemporary politics.
Yes.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I'm a rude man.
So you mentioned the monetary people.
Yeah,
and they were abstract.
Well, yeah, I just thought that in the opposite direction, to say that there's no such thing as society also seems quite kind of like withdrawn from the real world. Yeah.
Okay. And then to return to the original question of things like agape, and are we trying to, to what extent is it possible and desirable to find a sort of universal ethic, as Rawls is doing? I think it is. I think it is admirable. It is
always sounds like it's heading in a positive direction when the sentence starts with "it's admirable," or it's like when a government minister is told, "That's very brave, minister." Don't do it. Right. It's very brave.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, it's easier to make those kind of claims and state this kind of a mission in his day when you have such clear violations of what we would consider as decency and as justice and peace and all this. But what? So, okay, take agape as you mentioned. What does agape look like in practice? That is an ongoing debate. It's in individual, even in religious traditions. That is, it's why Christ spoke in parables, for instance, because these things are irreducibly contextual. There is something that unites it. So that the agape is a real principle. We were just talking before we started recording about Augustine. In the Confessions, he has to address a criticism of the Manichaeans against the Old Testament. If the customs in the Old Testament continually change and transform, can there ever be such a thing as justice? And Augustine has to reply, I think rightly, that the underlying principles of justice are universal. The problem is that they have to enter into human context and have to be applied, and this is a relative phenomenon. This is where justice truly becomes relative, but not to the sake of being able to make right and wrong claims about what is and what is not just. It's a puzzle. It's literally a puzzle, a game. And
I know
it can.
I was going to say I think the Rawls is very old-fashioned in a way. I mean, you're the philosopher, so you can probably relate to what I'm about to say more. But in that philosophical tradition, for someone writing in the 1970s, he's actually quite old-fashioned to be. And this is in Plato to NATO by Brian Redhead, which was a quintessential sort of studies of political thought tome for a long time. And in there it says, Rawls' theory is both more old-fashioned but also more successful in some ways. It is more old-fashioned in simply assuming that if we think hard about our moral obligations and put our minds to meeting them, we shall, on the whole, act rightly. Now, as I was saying before, he does have this very rationalist view that if this doesn't work, if his view of how you can rectify social injustice whilst maintaining political freedom doesn't work, then it will just be a result of not rationalizing far enough. But I think there's a massive issue with his essentially what is the social contract theory, which is that it completely lacks any identification of the situation, regardless even of the debates around individual liberties, which he's saying he's covered. I think, and I'd love you to expand on this, Jack, his lack of sort of like contemplating situationalist kind of concerns, because the feminist scholar Carol Pateman, in her Sexual Contract, which I've referenced a couple of times throughout this series, she says that Rawls essentially just emulates what every social contract theorist from the Enlightenment onwards has done, which is assume one position as a white man in the West and say that it's applicable to everyone. Now, obviously, he's saying that because he wants to try and help people, but ultimately he's doing the same thing of completely forgetting his place in the world and, as you said, abstracting himself from sort of reality and then saying that therefore the position that he's come to could be applicable and apply in all circumstances. But yeah, what would you say about the lack of situationism, Jack?
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good place to turn to Sandel.
Yeah, please do, actually. Yeah, let's go into that, and we can come back to the situation.
Well, but I'll try and maybe move it towards Sandel through answering that particular question. I mean,
a nice segue again.
We'll see if I can manage it. But yeah, I mean, the basic issue is a problem of human identity. That's how Sandel will look at it. If justice is going to be something meaningful to it, it has to be something a bit more than just solving problems of debt or very generic cases of injustice, like murder or whatever. It's got to have some very intimate connection to how we're actually living our lives, and so we all have different roles in society, and connections, obligations. Some of us have families, some of us tradesmen, and this does give us a very particular perspective on the world. Also, in the context of maybe of a national history and then maybe a religious history. We have therefore characteristic ways of framing problems. We have very specific values, which a rationalist critique would just completely overwrite as accidental, but in a certain situation might be, very, very important. And even be raised to the question of an injustice. So the basic problem is that, I guess, Rawls has simplified this too much, and has even erased the human subject in the process. So Sandel, in the article we looked at from the on the limits of liberalism, which is a text that he writes primarily in response to Rawls's version of liberalism, basically to say that the human factor has disappeared. The self is left bare of any substantive feature or characteristic that could qualify as a basis for claims of justice and injustice, or what is owed to someone. Even just thinking of the basic idea of justice as inheritance, or in relation to problems of inheritance, or what is due to you because of a certain effort you've exerted in society, for instance. Maybe you've worked, you've given your time to the company. So Sandel's, his whole career is beyond this book is about resituating the human person into political theory, and to do it in a way where the situations of the human subject come to the fore of these questions. I can give a bit of a history of that, bit of a summary. So Sandel was born in 1952. He's a American political philosopher and popular author on such subjects as liberty, justice, identity, and globalization, as well as the ethics of markets and of meritocracy. So you're already seeing the recovery of the human subject in this context, because Sandel was one of the foremost writers to say, actually, there are some things you shouldn't be able to sell on markets, for instance, like human body parts.
Which Nozick had famously said, if you want to, you can. Yeah,
right. So this won't do if we're going to have a justice that is human centered, that is socially centered, and there's I mean here's one way of thinking about it. When you abstract from the human subject, as Rawls does, it's not obvious on the economics paradigm of justice, let's say, which is sort of what justice question has just become once you've abstracted the human subject, why the things that matter to people would matter to them, like organ donations or slavery or or what else, or even just the question of excess in economic growth. That's not just, it's not a mathematical problem. It's because people feel dispossessed. It's because their local businesses suffer. And that's where they're deriving their identity, their meaning, their purpose. It's what's binding the local community together. And there's no economic argument for why that shouldn't be done away with. I mean, the economic argument seems to suggest, no, get rid of it because the globalization stuff is more efficient. The big corporations are producing what everyone needs at half the price, and and deface the world of grace and deface the world of the subject, the kind of thing someone like Rogers Scruton would say. Okay, so this is sort of what Sandel is coming up against. Where did he get this from? Well, he studied under Charles Taylor at Oxford. And Charles Taylor, the famous communitarian philosopher, not a communist philosopher. Communitarianism emerged in the 70s with the writing of Charles Taylor and Alistair MacIntyre, who were some of the first in the Anglophone academies, at least around this time, to raise serious objections to the supposed values neutrality of theories of liberal democracy and their tendency to abstract individuals from their social and historical context that we've been describing. They also, relatedly, they basically were making the argument for positive notions of freedom and positive notions of the common good, from within the confines of a plurality of views on these subjects. So Charles Taylor, for instance, he argues that we can have a constructive discourse about cultural values in a way that the libertarian philosophers really just shirk back from this question at all. He borrows from the scientific tradition. If you have a theory in science which accounts for more problems than the previous, it's sort of the one you go with. And this was sort of how he approached cultural discourse. If there are more moral complications, moral grey areas that one culture can make sense of over the other, for Charles Taylor, and I think Alistair MacIntyre also, that would be sort of how the culture would grow in a consistent way. And I think Sandel adheres to that also. So you see how cultural conversation, cultural discourse comes back to the fore of political thinking, whereas they seem to be quite distant in John Rawls, I would say, or at least abstracted. The other thing to note, I guess, also about this tradition is work of Alistair MacIntyre, which is especially interesting in this regard, because he wrote a book called After Virtue, and then another one called Which Justice, Whose Rationality? So really putting to the forefront these questions of, well, in this plurality, what do we do? And it was remarkable how both these thinkers really were able to, I think, convincingly present a path forward through complex cultural discourse without ever claiming, as Rawls does, to go outside of it. In many ways, very Kantian. Not in what Kant's actual political theory says, but in the actual metaphysics that underlies it. Maybe that's quite an ambiguous comment for me to make, but Kant's theory of transcendental idealism is all about getting to the object from within the subject. So this is a political analogy, let's say. Okay, Sandel's first publication that I mentioned was this book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, specifically targeting Rawls' theory of justice and the radical individualism that it presented there uncritically as value neutral. He published it after his employment at Harvard, which just after he began there, and he would teach classes on justice for over 2 decades, and even some of the most popular lectures that Harvard ever produced, and they were recorded, they were reproduced in various broadcasting networks across the globe. A striking amount of students he taught in this period, immense. His subsequent work includes Democracy's Discontent, 1996, Public Philosophy, 2005, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, and The Tyranny of Merit, 2020. I wanted to also just add that part of communitarianism, another way of thinking about it, is the recovery of irreducibly public goods. So it's not just I think a lot of liberalism tends to reduce to private interest, let's say, private goods, and then construct the public goods out of those under sufficient conditions. And Charles Taylor, for instance, was very big on the idea that no, there are irreducibly public goods, like family, like friendship, like language is one. If you follow Wittgenstein, anyway, there are certain jobs we might occupy ourselves with, which you can't do on your own and require another. All these ways that we come together to achieve things.
And I suppose, is rules theory too individualistic is the kind of quintessential link here in terms of
exactly. So this was Sandel's criticism. So individualist in its approach to society and to justice, and also then individualist in its view of the human person, which undergirded all that in its anthropology, let's say, like all the social contract theories to come before this, the idea that you can just abstract out of what has been inherited. This is what the communitarians are seeing as the root of so many missteps in their thinking, excess rationalism, loss of the subject in this public discourse, even ambiguity about what is social justice. Is it just economic?
I suppose he's also making rules, or his critiques are doing what Rawls maybe didn't want to do, which was to come up with a comprehensive doctrine, and is starting to say, well, where does an idea of, say, the good life come from? Well, it's our community, it's our values, the things that forge us. So to be able to create a system that is just, we surely have to have reference to the good life. And I suppose Sandel would say that's impossible, to create an idea of what Rawls's ideal kind of just state would be if you don't have some idea of what the good life is.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what these thinkers are trying to do, especially Alistair McIntyre, actually, is put that conversation right back at the fore and say, no, actually, this is something we can discuss and that we need to discuss, because our discourse around justice, while Rawls is there asserting this idea, no, we'll just abstract and we'll just pretend, we'll put on our veils of ignorance and we'll rationally discern the most appropriate principles for conducting ourselves in the absence of self-interest. What's actually going on in the real world is that all these social tensions and wars and other forms of strife that you've described already are putting enmity between people, between groups of people, and that is shaping the way they are thinking about justice, and it's intimately connected with their social situations in a way Rawls is completely ignoring, despite living in this time. And these thinkers are, the communitarian thinkers are completely inverting that. So rather than run away from the conversation that's happening around Rawls, I think they're embracing it better, but also criticizing it, realizing that it has prevailed for far too long on what Alistair McIntyre would call a motivist principles,
right?
And which is just the idea that ethics had by this point really just been reduced to what I assert is the good, because there had been such a radical loss of tradition and let's say like a cohesive worldview that could unite us in our ethical thinking. That turned out not to make us more rational, contrary to what Rawls would expect. In McIntyre's view, it has made us emotional and vindictive and unable to talk about this, which is quite remarkable.
And I mean, I suppose they're also exploring, is the self prior to its ends, is the individual able to get behind that veil of ignorance, unencumbered, as Rawls says, by kind of our motives and moral and communal responsibilities and obligations, and truly ever abstract ourselves when, of course, as we all know after this 6-part series, we're bricoleurs and we have to understand the world through the way that we've been reared and raised. And I mean, I think this certainly linked to what's going on in postmodernism, which we'll be exploring in the next series when we come to Foucault and that, when we look at heritage. Did I have anything else? I think the bit about the reference to the good was something that I really wanted to ask you about in terms of that communitarian. Did you have any other points about Sandel, Jack, that you wanted to make?
Let me think.
I mean, he's the only one of our scholars who's still alive.
He is. That's something that's worth noting. Yeah, and I mean, the last book I mentioned, The Tyranny of Merit, was written 5 years ago. So, and you can see him on YouTube. He gets around a lot.
I mean, it is interesting that these critiques of Rawls come from both essentially communitarian sort of views, but also obviously you've got critiques of Rawls coming from someone like Nozick as a libertarian. You've got critiques of Rawls coming from Carol Pateman as a feminist, and you have critiques of Rawls coming from Charles Mills as a post-colonial scholar. And I don't think necessarily that's a bad place to be, because I think what Rawls does come up with as a Rawlsian apologist, I think what Rawls does come up with, it's a very legalist system. He has said that he doesn't want to create a comprehensive doctrine to sort of try and, he's writing at a time that's in the midst of the Cold War, and one thing that obviously he really doesn't like is Soviet socialism. He doesn't like the dominating control that Soviet socialism has. Admittedly, he does say that he sort of becomes a socialist of some type by the end of his life, and his ideas are taken up by the social democratic countries of Scandinavia, for example. You can really see Rawls's influence in the way that Scandinavian states have developed, particularly in the 21st century. But I think the critiques come at him as a quintessential liberal, that he's trying to envisage some idea of creating the world to be a better place. And often we sometimes forget the motives of these individuals because we get wrapped up in criticism. And I think he has an admirable task, because he is trying to reduce what he's doing to essentially that, the sort of very iconic image of justice, which is Lady Justice standing there with a scales, with a blind around her, and saying that, to me, I don't know who you are, what your background is, but on the evidence that I shall receive, I want to give a just outcome. That is Rawls's idea of what he sees the responsibility of politics being, just as that's the responsibility when it comes to a courtroom. And I don't think that's a bad place to begin a political argument. I think the critiques just raise the flaws in implementation.
Yes. It's perhaps there are two different questions, and would be one way of thinking about it, and not necessarily that they have to be addressed separately, but I think they do. maybe they're not two separate questions, but certainly two relatively independent questions would be a better way of phrasing it. The structure of our institutions and I guess the way that they relate to individuals, let's say. Trying to, on the one hand, get that universalism right, but also this particular dimension that real people do bring in, what Sandel calls sickly constituted selves, in contrast to completely featureless selves of Rawls. Then I think what happens is if you can bring those two together, which is a precarious project, because I'm dissatisfied with a lot of the discourse around trying to make justice more humane, because I think it's often quite naive. This isn't a straightforward task, and for instance, the term social justice in itself, which is very much what Sandel is interested in, is very ambiguous and very manipulable. So though I have criticized Rawls for not contending with this question properly, the people who favor it also often struggle with it, because we're dealing with a very precarious thing, particularly because we're dealing with the complexity of people, and many people with all kinds of circumstances.
I agree.
How to bring the institutional question and the social question together is another one of our indissoluble problems. But the important thing for me is that we do not, which is the greater evil. I mean, certainly the way my philosophizing goes, I mean, I'm very interested in these philosophers who think about, constitutive subjectivity, constitutive freedom. I'm more anxious about the way in which our political theories neglect the subject than which they maybe give it too much credence. Although economists would probably be upset with me for saying that.
No. Oh dear.
Yeah, but look, I mean, it's not obvious that the economic motive and the social motive always, or the cultural motive, or the moral motive coincide. I think they do.
Private vices, public virtues.
Yeah, right. And I wouldn't be too pessimistic about this, but so and when these political philosophers are talking about institutions, they're mostly in the 20th century talking about economics. But politics has become economics. It's very strange.
Oh, essentially, primarily. You don't see politicians sitting around discussing ethics in a legislative chamber.
And when they want to, only 5 turn up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we hope that far more than 5 of you have turned up to watch this.
Yeah, we do.
And unless you have any concluding remarks, Jack, we can start.
I have a good quote from Sandel.
Oh, marvelous.
It's come from the end of the paper we said. I think I read it out also quite spontaneously in the seminar. I quite liked it. Liberalism, says Sandel, teaches respect for the distance of self and ends. And when this distance is lost, we are submerged in a circumstance that ceases to be ours. But by seeking to secure this distance too completely, liberalism undermines its own insight. By putting the self beyond the reach of politics, it makes human agency an article of faith rather than an object of continuing attention and concern, a premise of politics rather than its precarious achievement. This misses the pathos of politics and also its most inspiring possibilities. It overlooks the dangers that when politics go badly, not only disappointment but also dislocations are likely to result. And it forgets the possibility that when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we can't know alone.
Oh, lovely. That's a beautiful passage.
It's very, very, very nice, yes.
And we really have ebbed slowly and smoothly towards the mouth of the river that is our conclusion.
Yes.
Yes, we have.
Yes, we have. And that conclusion would be, Samuel.
It's not only a conclusion of discussing Rawls and Sandel, who I think have revealed themselves to be quintessential in the formation of the conclusion of the 20th century's political thought in the case of Rawls, and in formulating ideas about, as we've said, communitarianism, and about how do you weigh up the sort of abstracting from a, when a political philosopher like Rawls wants to abstract, and like many that we've covered, wants to abstract to some state outside of human condition, how do you tackle that when you're really talking about politics that is happening day to day? And I think what we've done in this series is cover these thinkers, how history has impacted their visions of liberty that have changed and fluctuated. Even the definition of liberty, as we started, we were talking about the idea that a liberty was a piece of land given out by a king, and now we're talking about equality of opportunity. Liberty has ebbed and flowed like the river of this discourse that we've had. It really has. It's been oscillating throughout history, and it will continue to do so. And I think what we've done is situate each of these cornerstones in the canon of defining liberty as a concept. I think we've contextualized them and done a rather good job of it, Jack, if I say so myself.
Indeed.
We've given it a stab. We've given it a stab.
Yeah. Well, it's a complex history to summarize and to do justice to. So I stumbled upon that. But yeah, how much changes in that period, as you say.
I think it's fascinating, because to be able to engage with these philosophical concepts correctly, you have to situate them within their time period, and that is what we've done. And now we've got a better idea, and we hope we've given you a better idea of how these ideas, they're not in a silo. You don't have to abandon them to history, but through contextualizing them, through exploring them in the way we have, I think they're much more ready to be pried open and used more effectively and in a more attuned manner than just simply going to the text and trying to apply it to the modern day. And we'll be doing the same thing all over again, which will be wonderful, with a series called Heritage that we're going to be running as a reading club. And we'll be coming back to you very shortly with an episode on Plato, so going much further back, so there'll be lots of semantic difference in our next series between ancients and moderns. But until then, Jack and I will let you go. We'll let Jack get back to some revision for his exam tomorrow.
Yes. I may go for a walk first.
Yes, to clear your mind.
Distract myself.
But wonderful, Jack. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.